we're here tonight, obviously in memory of Professor Arthur Hyman. And last year I stood here at the end of the Schlossing to speak about Professor Hyman's own work as a scholar of medieval Jewish philosophy. In addition, that was a time for sharing personal reminiscences of, for example, how he was there to greet me when I first arrived at YU on the day of my interview, when he and Miss Washington still occupied what is now the grand admissions office and kind of dean suite on the first floor of First Hall. How he spent the morning showing me around and making me feel more like an honoured guest than the nervous newbie that I actually was. And I remember him telling me then of his own personal memories of Rav Soloveitchik, who he knew was the focus of much of my own work. But tonight, in Professor Hyman's memory, Professor Dauber and I were asked to speak less about Professor Hyman himself and more about what was dear both to his heart and, one hopes, to this institution, and was at the forefront of his work here, which is Jewish philosophy itself. And while Professor Hyman's own work was primarily in medieval Jewish philosophy, he also taught and sometimes wrote about early modern philosophy. He taught early modern in Yeshiva College, and for many years he taught the survey of modern and contemporary Jewish philosophy at Revel. So to reflect the breadth that he encouraged in the department which he led at Revel for so many years, and to give you sitting here having to listen a little bit of variety, I'm going to focus this evening on modern Jewish philosophy. More specifically, I want to discuss Rav Soloveitchik's views regarding the nature of Jewish philosophy. My focus actually is going to be on why Soloveitchik wasn't terribly impressed with much of medieval Jewish philosophy, and simultaneously to present his own view regarding how we should revise our approach to the subject in the 20th century. But rather than delve immediately into philosophical abstractions, tempting though that is, I want to focus my remarks by posing a very simple question. Can one change the past? Okay, can one change the past? All right, just bear that question in mind. We will endeavour to answer it in two different ways. Now, despite the best efforts of some of my favourite movies to convince us otherwise, one presumes that the answer to this question is no. If my football team loses a game, as they are wont to do, I'm unable to say, well, let's just go back in time and try it again. And that this is the case seems to reflect a simple truth about the nature of things. It's not a truth that, for example, only applies to Jews and not to Muslims. It's a universal truth. It simply reflects the way the world is. Now, presumably, that's what philosophy is supposed to do, to tell us universal truths about the way the world is. And these truths are thought to be available to any rational researcher, regardless of their own personal interests or prejudices. More than that, this view of philosophy also reflects a conception of knowledge that was basically shared by the medievals and indeed the early moderns, Descartes, one of its fiercest proponents, whereby our job as philosophers, indeed our jobs as knowers per se, is simply to act as mirrors of reality. In order to know the world as it is, in order to know the truth about the world, we have to remove all our own subjective interests and prejudices and allow the world to speak for itself, so to speak. So we're supposed to be mere passive recipients of the truth that the world provides to us. And these truths are independent of our own interests or our subjective preferences. We're subjects, and we're looking to know a mind-independent object, the world. The truth about the world as it is, surely exists independent of our own interests and desires. I may believe the moon is made of cheese. I may even wish that it were, but it's not. And my interests and my desires cannot make it so. My interests are irrelevant. The world just is a certain way. And returning to our question, one of those ways that the world is such as to make it impossible for me to change the past. Now, to this point, you may be wondering why I am standing here stating what appear to be obvious platitudes. You may still think that by the end. However, if this is indeed the nature of philosophy, then Jewish philosophers are forced into apologetics. If science, or let's take Maimonides, if Aristotle has found these truths of which we have been speaking, then we are bound to them, and we need to make Judaism say the same thing. And that's Rav Soloveitchik's problem with Jewish philosophy. Okay, have a look at the first quote on the handout. Okay, so Rav Soloveitchik writes, towards the very end of the Halakhic Mind, medieval Jewish thought, despite its accomplishment and merit, has not taken deep root in Jewish historical religious realism and has not shaped Jewish religious world perspective. We know that the most central concepts of medieval Jewish philosophy are rooted in ancient Greek and medieval Arabic thought and are not of Jewish origin at all. It is impossible to reconstruct a unique Jewish world perspective out of alien material. Now, this criticism is all very well. He's saying that medieval Jewish philosophy is effectively just Aristotelianism as mediated by its Islamic interpreters, that in effect Maimonides is just Aristotle with a kippah on. But how else could it be? If Aristotle got things right, then surely Judaism has to acknowledge those truths that he discovered. It can't just make up its own. Now, of course, Aristotle actually got most things wrong, but the fact is that whichever philosophical worldview takes its place and is thought of as the correct one by our current standards, that would seem to be the one that we have to present as Jewish philosophers if we are to be doing philosophy at all. Indeed, for Maimonides, the reason that Judaism is supreme and the true religion is precisely because it leads us, in large part, to those truths. Judaism is true because it reflects those truths to a greater extent than anything else. Than Islam, for example, which in turn reflects those truths to a greater extent than Christianity, in Maimonides' view. But the knowledge they're all trying to reach is the same, the truth about the world. The truth is the truth, and that is the end of it. Or is it? Well, for Rav Soloveitchik, it very much is not. For Soloveitchik, in part inspired by contemporary science, does not believe that knowledge can be understood in terms of the model that we've just stated, whereby a neutral subject simply reflects this mind-independent truth fully formed with which the world provides us. But what's the alternative? What is the correct model for knowledge? Well, according to Soloveitchik, it's one that absolutely allows for our own subjective interests and is indeed formed by them, but in a very specific way. The idea is obviously not that we can just make the world conform to our interests. That's clearly nonsensical, as we said before. I cannot decide, for example, how many people are in this room or that the moon is made of cheese. But contrary to the view discussed so far, Soloveitchik believes we can, indeed we must, take account of subjective conceptual frameworks if we are to make any claims about the world at all. He puts forward a view known as Perspectivism, which he describes as follows. And again, this is the third quote on the handout. He tells us modern Perspectivism sees in the act of cognition a concomitant of a valuing act that occurs under certain practical and teleological aspects. In sum, approval or disapproval precede any cognitive act. The reason is the instrument of the will, and the theoretical act is subordinated to the volitional. Now, this quote might not hit the heights of clarity for those fortunate enough to be unsullied by exposure to philosophical jargon. So let's try and explain what he's saying here by appeal to a more picturesque analogy by the most famous modern perspectivist, Friedrich Nietzsche. And Nietzsche writes the following. It's the final quote on the front of the handout. He says, let us guard against the snares of such contradictory concepts as pure reason, absolute spirituality, knowledge in itself. These always demand that we should think of an I that is completely unthinkable, an I turned in no particular direction, in which the active and interpreting forces through which alone seeing becomes seeing something are supposed to be lacking. These always demand of the I an absurdity and a nonsense. There is only a perspective seeing, only a perspective knowing. And the more affects we allow to speak about one thing, the more eyes, different eyes we can use to observe one thing, the more complete will our concept of this thing, our objectivity, be. Now, what Nietzsche is saying here is appealing to sight. So all of you can see me right now, and you all see me from a different perspective. Every eye is located somewhere such that you have a particular perspective unique to you on me. And more than that, there can be no such thing as an eye that wasn't seeing from a specific location, from a specific perspective. That's the nature of sight. And that is why there is only a perspective seeing, according to Nietzsche. Now note, this does not mean that what you're seeing is not objectively there. All right? I am here. You are seeing something. You're seeing something real. But you're seeing different aspects of it. Moreover, there are things that could distort your vision, such that you could be said to be seeing something that's not there. So if, for example, you were wearing the proverbial rose-tinted spectacles, then I would have a pleasant rose-coloured sheen. But that would not reflect the reality of my pasty British complexion. Now, Nietzsche and Soloveitchik argue that this is actually the case for knowledge. The world does not present itself to us fully formed, wearing its concepts on its sleeve. We conceptualize the world in ways that depend upon our goals and our values, that depend upon our perspective. Again, to give you a very simple example, imagine you're going on a climbing holiday in Scotland, Scottish Highlands, beautiful mountains, and you want a map. So you'll get a map that will give you the topography of the area, something that will help you to climb. Imagine your friend is going on a driving holiday through the Highlands of Scotland. He will have a map with all the roads on it. Which map is correct? Well, clearly both of them. But they each serve, they each serve a specific interest. And both can, of course, misrepresent their object. They can get the roads wrong. They can get the gradients wrong. So each of them reflect a particular perspective. More than that, you couldn't have a map that represented every perspective. That wouldn't be a map, that would be the thing. Think similarly of art. Every artist paints what he sees, and he sees a particular perspective. And it would be impossible to have a painting that reflected every possible perspective. More importantly, it would be impossible to draw a painting that was from no perspective, just as you couldn't have a map that reflected no perspective. And the perspective is always informed by certain values, by certain goals. Nietzsche and Ralph Soloveitchik, when they speak of perspectivism, and if you go back now to the Soloveitchik quote, he says there that the act of cognition is a concomitant of a valuing act that occurs under certain practical and teleological aspects. His point is that any knowledge claim you make always presupposes certain objectives and certain values. In some, as he puts it, approval or disapproval precede a cognitive act. The will, your interests, actually are necessary for you to make any knowledge claim. That's the claim of Nietzsche, that's the claim of Rav Soloveitchik. Now, as Jews, those goals and values are derived from the halakhic system. Recall Rav Soloveitchik's picturesque accounts of seeing a spring in halakhic man, which we conceptualize as a mikveh, or a sunrise that we associate with Zmanei Tefillah. Obviously, we see things that way because we view the world through halakha-tinted spectacles. Other people do not. They might select for a different aspect of that reality, the beauty of the sunset, the spring as a place to swim. But it's not the case that one description is right and one is wrong. They're both right, but they reflect different conceptual schemes. And each has its own objective criteria. Whether that spring is indeed a mikveh will depend on a number of objective factors regarding the volume and source of the water, for example. And for Soloveitchik, this means, for Jewish philosophy, that it need not be concerned with the truths of Aristotelian or, in his own day, Kantian philosophy. For it can give its own view of the world as determined by halakhic concepts. This is what he means when he famously writes, and this is the second quote on the back of the handout, that there is only a single source from which a Jewish philosophical Weltanschauung could emerge, the objective order, the Halakha. With all of this in hand, let's return to our question of whether it's possible to change the past. Now, on the one hand, Rav Soloveitchik would absolutely agree with the scientist that we cannot. If he were present while an experiment was being done in a lab and the experiment went wrong, he would absolutely not suggest that we go back in time and try it again. And yet, when he speaks of tshuva, he argues that the halakhic concept of tshuva presupposes a concept of time whereby one can change the past. Thus, the Jewish concept of time differs from the, say, physicists' concept of time. But the important point to make is that it's not competing with the scientific concept. The Rav agrees that from a scientific perspective, with my scientific spectacles on, we indeed cannot change the past. But from a halakhic perspective, when I'm there in the Aseret Yimei Tshuva, for example, we can. Thus the title of my talk, Putting Truth in Perspective. For the Rav, Jewish philosophy is not concerned to tell us truths about the nature of the world that are supposed to compete with those of, for example, science. It's supposed to elucidate the nature of Judaism, specifically halakhic Judaism. And while that may sound less ambitious than the medieval attempt to uncover the truth about the universe, the Rav would argue that one, there's no such thing as the truth about the universe, and two, those kinds of truths are the province of other people, physicists, chemists, etc. Leave the science to the scientists. As Jewish philosophers, we're interested in understanding our religion, and that's what he sets out to do. And doing so need not look beyond the halakhic system for the formulation of ideas. As he states in the Halakhic Mind, third quote on the back, every system of cognition strives to attain a distinct objective. Systematic knowledge means the understanding and grasping of the universe in consonance with a definite telos, goal, aim, purpose. The object reveals itself in manifold ways to the subject, and that a certain telos corresponds to each of these ontical manifestations. Subsequently, the philosopher or scientist may choose one of the many aspects of reality in compliance with his goal. So similarly, the Jew can choose an aspect of reality in compliance with his goal. Again, not to compete with that of the scientist, but to elucidate that which is relevant when one is engaged in religious acts. And therefore, to continue, If the philosophy of religion, says Soloveitchik, asks, for example, how the Homo religiosus interprets the concepts of time, space, causality, substance, ego, etc., then it would have to look into the objective theories and examine norms, beliefs, articles of faith, religious texts, etc. Out of this objectified material, the philosopher of religion may glean some hints regarding the structure of the most basic religious cognitive concepts. We can have our own concepts of these things. They don't have to be Aristotle's, but that's because we're talking about a different aspect of reality than Aristotle was talking about. Now, this view of Jewish philosophy has many ramifications. There's much more to be said about it, and we're not going to say it tonight. But I will leave you with just one that I think is appropriate to this evening. And that is that, given the dependence of philosophical claims on one's prior evaluative interests, people will likely have rather different views depending on those different prior commitments. And that's even the case for Jewish philosophy. Look, for example, at what Rav Soloveitchik wrote about his philosophy of prayer. Final quote on the handout. He writes, "When I speak about the philosophy of prayer, I do not claim universal validity for my conclusions. I'm not lecturing on philosophy of prayer as such, but on prayer as understood, experienced, and enjoyed by an individual. I acquaint you with my own personal experience. Whether taking into consideration the differences between minds and the peculiarities of the individual, my experience can be detached from my idiosyncrasies and transferred to others, I do not know. To say that my feeling of certitude carries universal significance would be sheer ignorance." This, I would argue, is not an example of the sort of rabbinic humility one often finds in rabbinic works, of the I am but dust and ashes variety. Rather, it reflects a deeply held conviction that Rav Soloveitchik had regarding the nature of knowledge. Rav Soloveitchik clearly has great conviction in his view, and yet his conception of knowledge allows for a degree of humility and tolerance of views that may differ from his own. And there could be no better way of remembering Professor Hyman than as a man who was committed to the pursuit of truth, but always in a spirit of humility and tolerance.